welcome to another episode of History Hack. We got to do this. Let me get it over with. The faster I do it, the faster we get to our fabulous guest today. So remember, you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple. We desperately need those. Send them away. We have a new website. It's www.historyhack.co.uk. That's where you find our bios, merchandise, and all our really interesting cartoons. If you want to help, or if you want to help us live, basically, you can do a one-off donation at Ko-fi, which is ko-fi.com/historyhack. My dogs need to be fed, my garden needs to be watered, and my plant habit needs to be funded. You can also become one of our super loyal supporters at Patreon, which is www.patreon.com/historyhack. There we have all fabulous perks, like, for example, free book prizes and all various different Chris perks. I can't remember which one I've brought up recently, but it'll be something along the lines of like dinner or Chris's hair or a message from Chris at the end of the episode. But moving on, our fabulous guest today is Jodi Magness. She's an archaeologist and a scholar of religion. She's written some fabulous books on the archaeology of Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls and Masada, from Jewish to modern myth. And she's here to talk to us about her fabulous new book, which I'm super excited about. And it's about Jerusalem through the ages. Hi, Jodi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I am super excited. Chris is also super excited because we get to talk about archaeology. We haven't done archaeology in such a long time, and it's really great to kind of plug that gap a little bit.
Great. I'm all about archaeology.
You're currently in Jerusalem right now, though, aren't you?
I am, yes.
And are you doing a dig out there right now?
No, I have been directing an excavation at a site in Galilee since 2011, a site called Huqoq, which is spelled Huqoq. And last summer, this was planned long ago. Last summer was our last season of excavation. So my senior staff are arriving this weekend, actually, so that we can start working on final publication.
Oh, wow. I know this is off topic. Now I've just gotten really interested in this. Slightly off topic, and then we'll get back to your book. What is probably the most interesting thing you found on that dig that you can talk about, obviously?
Oh, yeah. No. It's easy. It's gotten a huge amount of publicity. And in fact, if your listeners want to check it out, the dig website is huqoq.org, huqoq.org. And some of our discoveries were featured in the April issue of National Geographic magazine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, what we brought to light, among other things, is a late Roman period synagogue, so about 400 AD, paved with extraordinary mosaic floors showing a whole array of biblical stories. So we've got scenes of Samson, the Red Sea, the building of the Tower of Babel, Noah, Daniel, scenes from the book of Daniel, Deborah and Barak. I mean, just goes kind of on and on. So yeah, absolutely spectacular.
That's actually really exciting. So if by the listeners who do know me know that I spent some time back in Israel a couple of years ago, and I loved going to those places where you have these extraordinary mosaics, especially when I went to Caesarea and the locations around it. There are such I just could not imagine that mosaics could be made that beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I actually worked at Caesarea on the excavations at Caesarea when I was a graduate student back in.
Oh my days, really?
Yeah, I did. But I have to say, and here it's not because I'm partial to my site, but our mosaics blow the mosaics at Caesarea and pretty much everywhere else out of the water. So you can check it out online. We have all the media coverage and our publications with photos and everything. So yeah. Don't take my word for it. Check it out.
Okay, do you know what? While we're chatting, I might go and do that, actually. But right, we're going to be talking about Jerusalem. Jerusalem's, I mean, God, we could talk about Jerusalem probably all day. But I'm quite interested in knowing why did you write a book about Jerusalem?
Actually, it was because of a very persistent editor at Oxford University Press. It was not something that I had planned to do. I mean, I have been involved in research in Jerusalem since, my dissertation actually was on Jerusalem. But writing a book with this kind of, comprehensive scope, going from the beginnings of the settlement in Jerusalem all the way up to the Crusades, that was not something that I actively thought of doing. But Stefan Branca, who's my editor at OUP, really persisted for years in persuading me to take this on, and eventually I sort of gave in, and that's really That's really what happened. There was a launch for the book yesterday at the Albright Institute here in Jerusalem, where I had a fellowship while I was writing. And I said, writing a book like this may seem to be an act of hubris because yeah, it's such a huge subject. But actually, it was a very humbling experience because you realize how much you don't know about Jerusalem. And of course, I have plenty of colleagues, especially here in Jerusalem and in the country, who know, I think, a lot more about Jerusalem than I do. So yeah, that was kind of the backstory to how the book came about.
It's such a beautiful city. I think out of all of the places that I went to, I loved Jerusalem the most. You can spend, I mean, I didn't take buses, I didn't take trains, I didn't take tax. I walked. I just
Yeah.
walked around Jerusalem. That was it. That was the end of my
It
day.
is. You're absolutely right. It's a great walking city, and that's one of the things that I enjoy too. I can walk the same route every day, and every time I do it, I see something that I hadn't noticed before. It really is like that.
Yeah, Aline, you've been babbling about Jerusalem too much. But Jodi, if you had to pick sort of one or three locations, I know it's like trying to pick your favorite child. For mine, it's Oliver at the moment. But if you had to pick one, which one would you go for?
I can't choose my favorite child. I actually, at the end of the book, I have a series of suggested walking tours for readers, where we visit many of the sites that I mentioned throughout the book. And some of those sites are kind of my little favorites that I stuck in there. Places like the area where the Arch of Ecce Homo is located, which is the Church of the Sisters of Zion. These are places that are a little off the beaten track. The Alexander Nevsky Church, which is the Russian Alexander Hospice next to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for example. The area of the Temple Mount, how can you not? It's a little bit of a cliche, but how not? I like the views. You can go out a little bit outside the area of the old city and get great views from the top of Mount Scopus and the Mount of Olives, for example, or from the area actually where I'm located right now, sort of to the southwest of the city. There's a promenade. And also some areas outside the immediate area of the walls of the old city. I have a long discussion of the so-called third wall in my book, which runs right through the yard of the Albright Institute. So yeah, I think those would be some of my favorite children.
Okay, let's dig into a bit of archaeology and a bit of history here. How far back can we really, let me phrase that a little bit differently. What is the earliest settlement that we have discovered about Jerusalem? Where does all of this start? Where does Jerusalem become Jerusalem?
Right. Well, the earliest archaeological remains that we have of people living in Jerusalem, as opposed to, let's say, scattered artifacts that aren't necessarily associated with permanent occupation. Uh, so the earliest remains that we have of a permanent settlement go back to the early Bronze Age, which is about 5,000 years ago. So that's a very long time. The remains are very scattered and few because they've been overbuilt and largely obliterated over the course of time. But, there are things like parts of houses, some tombs with pottery in them. So we know that already, let's say, some 5,000 years ago, people were living in Jerusalem. Although I should also qualify and say that the earliest settlement in Jerusalem, including where these remains have been discovered, is a little hill that today is completely outside the walls of the old city. And here I should actually qualify and say that, you know, um, so Jerusalem is a big, modern, sprawling city, obviously. But in the heart of the modern city of Jerusalem is an area that is enclosed by walls that's called the Old City of Jerusalem. And many tourists to Jerusalem, I think, have the mistaken impression that the old city is the ancient city. And that's not exactly correct. The walls of the old city, as you see them today, were built in the Ottoman period, the 16th century, although they do follow an earlier line, but they don't actually enclose the area of the original settlement in Jerusalem. And they do not enclose an area that corresponded with the area of the city throughout many of its periods of history. So so today what you see is this, like, kind of almost a square, kind of square area enclosed by the walls of the old city. In the southeast corner is the big open paved esplanade of the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque are located today, the Muslim monuments. But then to the south of the Temple Mount and outside the walls of the old city is this little hill. And that's where that very earliest settlement is located. And then for actually many centuries afterwards, that's where the city of Jerusalem continued to be located.
So most people who know me know that I spend a lot of time wandering around graveyards and have an over fascination in burial stuff. Do you have any sort of tombs within Jerusalem that has been found through archaeology? And if so, what have the contents of the tombs told us about the people who are buried there?
Right. So we do actually have a lot of ancient tombs around Jerusalem, and I discuss some of them in my book. The tombs that we have that have survived and have been discovered archaeologically, for the most part, are rock cut tombs, meaning kind of like artificial caves that were cut into the bedrock slopes of the city. Because Jerusalem's high in the mountains, it's actually on the watershed of the Judean hills or Judean mountains. So it's very rocky. It's like these rocky outcrops. And the city is built on top of these rocky outcrops separated by valleys. And so outside the area of the ancient city, for the most part, people in ancient Jerusalem buried their dead outside the walls of the city. So we do have these kind of artificial caves that were used as tombs that are cut into the rocky outcrops of the slopes outside the city. And many of them have been explored archaeologically. But virtually all of them were robbed out of their contents long ago, or at the very least were found disturbed. And so in terms of the actual contents, for the most part, that has not survived. But the tombs themselves are very interesting in terms of the layout and the decoration, which often reflect foreign cultural influences on the local population of Jerusalem. And so, for example, in the Iron Age, we see Egyptian and Phoenician influence on the people of Jerusalem. In later periods, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, we begin to see Greek influence on the tombs of these inhabitants. And for the most part, when we talk about these rock cut tombs, we're talking about tombs that belong. They're kind of like mausolea. They were family tombs that belong to the upper classes of Jerusalem society, because the elite were the ones who could afford to commission these rock cut tombs and bury their dead in them. The majority of the population, by the way, was interred or disposed of or buried, if they did get a proper burial, in ways that have left few, if any, traces in the archaeological record. So what we have actually is a very small part of the burials or the tombs that would have contained the burials of the ancient population.
You've got to have a tomb that you discovered something in it that was like, wow, this changes the narrative.
Well, I don't know about that, but there is actually one tomb, or one part of one tomb, that was discovered intact. And that was in 1980. An archaeologist named Gabi Barkai, a local archaeologist, was conducting an excavation just outside the area to the northwest of the old city. It's a site called Ketafinom. Today, there is a Scottish church on the spot, the Church of Scotland, St. Andrews, located on this rocky outcrop. But cut into the rocky outcrop are a series of these rock cut tombs from the late Iron Age, meaning we're basically talking 7th century BC into the 6th century BC. Jerusalem, of course, was destroyed in 586 BC. So for the most part, these tombs went out of use around that time. And in the course of excavating in this tomb, he found that there was a space where there was originally a repository, meaning that burial gifts that had been placed with the bodies, together with earlier remains, had been put into this kind of hollowed out space. And at some point in antiquity, the ceiling of the repository, which was bedrock, collapsed and buried the contents. And therefore, the contents were never discovered by tomb robbers. And the archaeologists were able to excavate that repository and recover the remains, both the actual skeletal remains, but also the burial gifts that have been placed with them. And it was very interesting. They found, of course, pottery vessels and things like that. But among the finds is a very rare early coin. I think it's maybe the earliest coin ever found in Israel. It's not a local coin. It's from the area of the Aegean. And 2 little silver amulets that were inscribed in biblical Hebrew script and biblical Hebrew language, that contain, among other things, the priestly blessing, right? May the Lord, shine, make his face to make his countenance to shine upon you, bless you. And anyway, so these little rolled up amulets had these inscriptions, and this is the earliest actual artifact that we have of the priestly blessing from the Hebrew Bible. So we're going back again to like the 7th century and early 6th century. So fantastically important. Those amulets are on display in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and I have a description of them in the relevant chapter in the book.
So you mentioned the destruction in 586 BC. Why was the city destroyed, and what kind of archaeological evidence is there for it?
Yeah, so the city was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians. And so one of the things that happens throughout sort of the periods leading up to 586 BC is that you had two, and this actually was the case for a very long time in the ancient world. There were two major kind of geopolitical powers, and the area of Jerusalem lay kind of right in the middle between them. You had Egypt to the south, and then Mesopotamia to the sort of northeast. Mesopotamia, the area of modern Iraq, where over the course of antiquity there were a series of different important empires, including the Assyrian Empire. And now what we're talking about for 586 BC is the Babylonian Empire. And so in 586 BC, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and the kingdom that it was the capital of, which was the kingdom of Judah, and forced the inhabitants of Jerusalem and Judah to go into exile in Babylonia. And this begins a period in Jewish history that we refer to as the Babylonian exile. When I say forced to go into exile, we're really referring to the elites and not the majority of the population. The majority of the population, the poor people, were left behind. But the idea here was to uproot and displace the elites who were the power base, right? The local power base. And so they're sent into exile, an exile that lasts for approximately 60 to 65 years until the next major power, the Persians, allow the exiles to return and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. We have biblical accounts of this conquest, this destruction, but also archaeological evidence that's been found in various excavations around the city. One of my personal favorites actually is in a house that was excavated back in the 1970s by an Israeli archaeologist named Yigal Shiloh, who I talk about also in my chapter on the explorers. He was one of my professors as an undergraduate. So he conducted excavations on that little spur hill that I talked about before, and discovered a series of houses that were basically inhabited in, let's say, the 8th, 7th, and early 6th centuries BC, and had then were destroyed by the Babylonians. Clear evidence of destruction in 586. And one of the houses yielded a cache of bullae. Now, bulla is a little lump of clay that was used to seal a document in antiquity, or a package for that matter. So, of course, in antiquity, if you had a document, usually what you had were scrolls, right? They didn't have sheets of paper like we have today. They had scrolls. And how do you seal a scroll? You roll it up, and then you tie a string or something like that around it, and you take a lump of raw clay and put it over the string, and then impress the clay with a seal, like could be worn around your neck or around your wrist, that has your name or your personal insignia on it. And the person then who wants to open up that document would have to peel the lump of clay off. Now, because these lumps of clay were raw, most of the time we don't necessarily find them in archaeology, because after thousands of years, they just turn back into mud. But in this case, where we have a destruction and the houses were burned down by the Babylonians in 586 BC, what happened? There apparently was an archive of documents stored in this one house. And the fire, of course, that destroyed the house burned the documents, burned the scrolls, but fired the little lumps of clay, the sealings. And so he found this cache of sealings, little lumps of clay, these bullae, and they have little impressions on them with the names of the owner or owners in biblical Hebrew script. And it's a very kind of formulaic naming on them. So it'll say like belonging to so-and-so, son of so-and-so, right? That's kind of the formula. And so very, very interesting. Most of the names that occur are very common names among the population of Jerusalem in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. So, like every other person was named Joe or or Jim or something like that, but like that, right? Um, but there is a bulla that bears a name that is very unusual, Gemariyahu, son of Shaphan. And the interesting thing about that name, besides its being unusual, is that that is a figure who is mentioned in the book of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, as a scribe who was active in the court of the king of Judah shortly before 586 BC. So it fits perfectly. So, and of course, a scribe would be just the sort of person to be sealing documents. So, this is one of those few cases in archaeology where we can say with about as much certainty as you get. It's not, there's no guarantee 100%, but this is one of those very rare cases where we have a really strong correspondence between a person, an individual mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and an archaeological artifact.
That moment must have been so euphoric because, as we very well know, working in archaeology so far back, you have so many uncertainties and what ifs and what could be or what could have been, those kind of many questions that you just need to answer. And there you have basically an evidence from written and physical, something that you have an answer for.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, that's the great thing about archaeology, of course, right? That first of all, you never know what you're going to find. You're always going to find something pretty much, at least if you're digging in this area. But you never know what it's going to be. And you always get those kind of amazing moments when you're just like, right, just blown away.
So I've got a question. Moving on a little bit forward in time, because we're not going to cover everything in your book. The reason being is that we want people to go out and buy it, right? So I'm sorry, everybody, if you wanted me to ask a specific question, you're going to have to go and read about it. I want to talk a little bit about Alexander the Great, because does he actually make it to Jerusalem?
That's a big debate. Yeah. It's kind of interesting because we started out with the synagogue at Hukok, and we have a mosaic panel in that synagogue that I believe depicts the legendary story between the meeting of Alexander the Great and the Jewish high priest, which is a story that developed long after the time of Alexander, apparently. But anyway, so I'm kind of like immersed in this whole question about Alexander and what happens. So I will say I think it's probably safe to say that a majority of scholars, and this is me included, do not think that Alexander actually visited Jerusalem. Personally, I see no reason why Alexander would have gone to Jerusalem. It was out of his way. It was kind of a remote, mountain city, the sort of, seat of this kind of weird people, the Jews, for Alexander, as he's on his military campaign, so he's basically going from the north, from the area of Syria in the north, and he's going down to Egypt. And that road would have been the coastal road. And we know actually that he took the coastal road. I see no reason why he would have detoured inland to Jerusalem. So we know that he took the coastal road, and that's taking you down by the Phoenician city of Tyre and down through Gaza, which was, of course, originally a Philistine city, and then, on his way to Egypt. So there really would have been no good reason that I can think of for Alexander to have gone out of his way to go specifically to Jerusalem during the course of his campaign. But what happens later in Jewish tradition is that, at the time, by the way, at the time of Alexander's conquest, I don't think anybody recognized the significance of it because, armies pass through this country all the time. And rulers changed and everything all the time. And so it wasn't until after the death of Alexander, when Alexander became so famous, the Great, that the Jews, like other ancient peoples, by the way, sought to associate themselves with Alexander and his greatness. And you begin to get the development of these legends about Alexander coming to Jerusalem, or meeting with the Jews, if not in Jerusalem, then maybe somewhere else. There's a slightly different tradition about it, and how he shows reverence to the God of Israel by way of the Jewish high priest. So those kind of traditions. Very interesting, by the way, Alexander's conquests are also referred to in the biblical book of Daniel. So there's a whole, there's a whole series of Jewish traditions that develop about Alexander and his conquests, but they're later, right? They develop after his time when he became the Great.
So we're moving away from one sort of possible foreign occupier to one that was a definite foreign occupier. What was Rome's interest in Jerusalem?
Um, it's not. I actually wouldn't put it that way. I don't know that Rome had a specific interest in Jerusalem, and actually, it's a good question to explain. I mean, the reason is, and this I explain at the beginning of the book, is Jerusalem's importance does not stem from a strategic location. So, in that regard, Jerusalem is important, not in the same way as other great Mediterranean cities like Athens or Rome or, Istanbul slash Constantinople.
But how
Its
do they sort of
importance
change the
stemmed from
architecture of it?
it
Because
becoming
they kind of move away
associated
from
with the
the sort
place
of.
where the presence of the God of Israel dwells, right? The God who becomes the major deity for the three Abrahamic faiths. But Jerusalem itself was always really a kind of a poor, isolated mountain city, right? It doesn't have a lot of natural resources. It's not on major thoroughfares in the country. The major thoroughfares were, as I said before, when Alexander goes, from Egypt north to Syria, let's say, he's taking the coastal road. There are roads that go through Jerusalem, but it lies on this mountainous watershed, and it's not the easiest way to go. So the Romans would not have been interested in Jerusalem per se because it wasn't a city rich in resources. It didn't have a strategic advantage. But they would have been interested in the country, and Jerusalem, of course, was in the middle of the country. They would have been interested in the country for the same reason that everybody else was fighting over this country in antiquity, because it's on a kind of a crossroads between major power blocks in different directions, right? You want to go somewhere else, you got to go through here, and that's really what the importance of it is. So that's how I would answer that question.
So you have a quite a major revolt against Rome by the Jews in Jerusalem. How does that affect the city?
Right. So what happens is that, so just a little bit of background here, which is that in the first century BC, Rome annexes the territory, the area around Jerusalem, which had been part of a kingdom that was ruled by a Jewish dynasty, the Hasmoneans. And eventually, the Romans appoint a client king to rule the country on their behalf, and that's King Herod the Great, the sort of famous or infamous Herod. And then, after Herod dies in 4 BC, his kingdom was divided among his sons, and then eventually the Romans start to send in prefects or procurators, these kind of local governors, to administer the country for them. And then 70 years after Herod's death, in the year 66 AD, a Jewish revolt broke out against Rome, which we call the First Jewish Revolt against Rome. And that revolt affected the entire country, but Jerusalem was really kind of a center point of it. And that revolt lasted officially for 4 years. The last city officially, so I say officially because there were a couple of holdouts after 70, but we'll leave those aside. The Romans subdued the entire country and left Jerusalem for last. And so the revolt actually ends with a Roman siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 that is described in excruciating detail by an ancient Jewish historian whose name is Josephus, full name Flavius Josephus. And it was a siege that was horrible, filled with all sorts of atrocities and starvation. And anyway, the revolt that ends in 70, and when it ends in 70 and the siege ends, the Romans take the city, and the city is destroyed, including the temple on the Temple Mount. That's the second temple on the Temple Mount. That's also destroyed, and that really marks a real break in the history and archaeology of Jerusalem. So basically, after that, Jerusalem is lying in ruins for a while.
Do we have any archaeological evidence of the destruction? Is there anything that
Well,
still
actually,
exists?
we do have archaeological evidence of the destruction. It sounds horrible to say, but one thing that we always say about archaeologists is that we love destruction, because when you have a destruction level, you find in it all of the stuff that was in use at the time of that destruction. Whereas otherwise, what happens is people continue to live and they just rebuild and everything gets cleared out. So it's kind of like a snapshot in time. So we do actually have archaeological remains of the destruction in 70. And one of the most vivid examples of that is a house that was excavated again after 1967. So let's say in the 1970s by an Israeli archaeologist named Nachman Avigad. The house is located in the part of the old city today that's called the Jewish Quarter. And that house, which was dubbed the Burnt House by Avigad, was called the Burnt House because the floors were covered with layers of soot from the destruction of the house in 70. And buried in the collapse are artifacts that were in use at the time, but also the skeletal arm of a young woman about 20 years of age. So human remains actually associated with the destruction. Now, Avigad assumed that the house had been destroyed by the Romans when they took the city, at the end of the siege in 70. But since then, it's been suggested by other archaeologists that, in fact, the house either burned down during the course of the siege as a result of infighting between the various Jewish factions in the city, or possibly during the course of the Roman assault on the city, as opposed to, the very end when it was destroyed. But either way, there's very vivid evidence of that, of that siege and destruction in 70 that's been found there and also in other places around the city.
How do you go about rebuilding a city after that?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So the city literally was lying in ruins for several decades after 70. And what happens is that in 128, 129 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian traveled through the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire and visited Jerusalem, which was still lying in ruins. And Hadrian, as I'm sure you know and many of your listeners know, was, in addition to being a Roman emperor, was an amateur architect. He's the one who designed and built the Pantheon that still stands in Rome today. And so he travels through, he sees Jerusalem lying in ruins and decides that he's going to rebuild the city. But not as a Jewish city, because Hadrian was a lover of all things Greek. He had been educated in Greece and loved Greek culture. So what he decides to rebuild the city, not as a Jewish city, but rather as a pagan Roman city with a new name, Aelia Capitolina, and to dedicate a new temple on the Temple Mount, not to the god of Israel, who of course had been the patron deity of the city previously, but to Capitoline Jupiter instead. And I have a chapter on Aelia Capitolina, Hadrianic Jerusalem. It's been the focus of a lot of my own research. It's a fascinating chapter in the history of the city because it's a little less well known than some of the other periods of time. I like to say it's because, the periods that typically have been focused on are the periods when you had either an Israelite/Jewish population or a Christian population or a Muslim population, because all those people are still around and have a stake in the city, but there are no Romans anymore to claim a stake in the city. So that period hasn't received as much scholarly attention, although now it does actually. And so, the remains that we have from Aelia Capitolina, they're really interesting. There's a lot of debate about how big the city was, where there was the 10th Legion, the 10th Roman Legion was camped in the city. Where was the camp of the 10th Legion? But very interesting, we do see that a lot of the remains are concentrated in the destroyed northern part of the pre-70 city, which was the part that was less overburdened with destroyed buildings. So that's one of the things that we see. And what Hadrian does then is that he really redesigns the city pretty completely along a Roman model, a nice model with a kind of a square layout with a grid plan and, major north-south streets going through. So it really does change in its appearance and character. And I should add that Hadrian's decision to rebuild Jerusalem as this pagan Roman city provoked the outbreak of a second Jewish revolt, which is called the Second Jewish Revolt against the Romans, or the Bar Kokhba Revolt, which was pretty brutally put down. It was costly to the Romans and it was brutally put down. And as a result of that, Hadrian then not only rebuilt Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, but also prohibited Jews from living in the city and in its environs. And so the city of Aelia Capitolina, this Roman Jerusalem, was Roman, pagan Roman, not just in, the appearance, but also in the actual population of the city. There were no Jews living in it.
I've got two questions. I'll start with the first one because otherwise we're going to go on forever. But when did Jews finally allowed back into the city?
Yeah, it's funny. That's a question that we don't have an answer to, or at least that scholars don't agree. We don't have clear evidence either from archaeology or from our literary sources. So there is a question about how long Hadrian's ban on Jewish population was in effect, and it depends on who you read. So it may have been only for 2 or 3 generations, but even if that's the case, whatever Jewish population may have sort of returned to the city was very minimal, if at all. And that the non-Jewish composition of the city lasted literally for centuries, through the period that comes afterwards, after this, which is the Byzantine period, when the Roman Empire becomes a Christian empire. The city of Jerusalem then becomes a Christian city, not a Jewish city. And you really don't get the return of any kind of measurable Jewish population to Jerusalem until the 7th century AD, when you have first the Sassanid Persian invasion. Jews return then for a short period, and then with the Muslim conquest a little bit later in the 7th century, Jews really are, allowed back in and reestablish sort of a sizable presence in the city.
Okay, second part of my question. If I was to go back to Jerusalem today, what would I find from that time period still standing that I could go and visit or see?
Which time period specifically?
Oh, the one we were just talking about. So around this, the Hadrian's
Yeah,
rebuilding of the
yeah.
city.
So actually there's quite a bit. And I highlight some of this in my walking tours at the end. So there were a series of monumental triple arch gateways that marked the entrances to public spaces around the city. And some remains of these gateways still exist. So, for example, the modern Damascus Gate, which is the main gate in the north wall of the old city, is actually built over the Hadrianic Triple Arch Gateway. And when you walk in, you can actually see part of it under you. The so-called Arch of Ecce Homo, which some Christians at least now revere as the spot where Pontius Pilate, after sentencing Jesus to death, put him in purple robes and crowned him with a crown of thorns and displayed him to the crowd and said, Ecce Homo, behold the man. That arch actually is also Hadrianic, and it's in the Church of the Sisters of Zion on the Via Dolorosa. And there are also remains of another triple arch gateway that led into another forum that Hadrian established on the western side of the city by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And those remains are in the basement of the Alexander Nevsky Church. And you can also see the remains of the so-called Third Wall, which is a wall that's located to the north of the old city, which I believe, not everybody agrees with me, but which I believe are part of a line of wall that Hadrian planned to mark the northern limit of Aelia Capitolina. And that is the wall that I mentioned before that runs through the grounds of the Albright Institute. So there's actually quite a bit, but it's kind of scattered around, and the remains are kind of scattered enough that there are substantial disagreements among archaeologists about certain features of Aelia Capitolina.
Jodi, we've only reached to the Byzantines right now, and there is so much more. Oh God, so much more we could talk about. I think what we're going to have to do, you're going to have to come back at some stage, because this can't be I mean, I know we want people to go and watch. I know we want people to go and read the book, but I'm now really invested in continuing this story. And because the thing is, reading it is different, and you're such a fabulous speaker that I could just sit here and listen to you talk. Hopefully you read your own audio. Do you read your own audiobook?
I have never read my own audiobook, and so I don't know what to tell you. At some point, somebody a little while back contacted me and asked if there was going to be an audiobook of this. I have no idea. That's not but my editor said that usually what they do is they make an audiobook of it like 6 months after it comes out or something like that. But I've never had anything to do with the audiobook, so I don't know. I can't.
I think you're going to have to read it, because one of my friends actually read his, and he's got a fabulous voice. So I think it would be just such a waste if you didn't read it.
Thank you. I have to tell you, since you're mentioning that, I have to tell you a funny story that you will appreciate. So, about 15 years ago, I participated in the production of a giant screen film on Jerusalem called Jerusalem the movie. It's a fantastic film, by the way, and I'm not just saying it because I was involved in it. And the narrator is Benedict Cumberbatch,
Oh,
who who I did not meet. But we had after the filming, the producers and directors, they did voiceovers. So I went to tape some voiceovers, and there was this one voiceover that I did, which was on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And then I never heard anything after that. And then the film came out, and I saw the film. And the first time I saw it, lo and behold, that voiceover in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not my voiceover; it's Benedict Cumberbatch. And I said afterwards, I said to the director, I said, "Well, what happened? I taped that voiceover." And he said, "Yeah, well, we all sat around and we listened to you and we listened to Benedict Cumberbatch, and we all preferred Benedict Cumberbatch."
rude. How rude is, do you know what? They don't know what they missed out on.
I lost that one. So anyway, but
Absolutely
If it makes you feel
rude.
better, he can't say the word penguins. He genuinely can't. I saw him do a voiceover and he just keeps calling them penguins. So as long as you can say penguins, you're doing better than Benedict Cumberbatch.
there are no penguins in Jerusalem. But
But you just said the word penguin perfectly and he can't. So yeah, Jodi, this has been really, really interesting. As Alina was saying, could you remind everyone the title of your book, though? So
sure. The title of the book is Jerusalem Through the Ages, From Its Beginnings to the Crusades. And it's available on Amazon, on the Oxford University Press website. Sure, if you Google it, you can, go to my webpage, jodimagness.org. There's a link there as well. Yeah.
and we'll get it for the History Hack website as well. So that way you get us more of the money, we get a tiny slice of the money, and that popular book selling website you might have mentioned can't continue to build Death Stars and spaceships. So which is all good.
There you go.
Just to remind our visitors what Alina said at the beginning, if you enjoyed the episode, please do give us a like or 5 stars, wherever the platform you're listening to is on. You can also support us on monthly donations through patreon.com/historyhack, or you could just buy us a drink at ko-fi.com/historyhack. And thanks for listening, and see you all next time.